Now, some of the countries that will be hardest hit by the tariffs are in Asia. And for more, let's bring in Trinh Nguyen. She's senior economist at Natixis. She joins us now from Hong Kong. Trinh, welcome. Asian economies are facing higher tariffs than many others. For example, China is looking at about 54% cumulative tariffs. Cambodia is looking at about 49%, Vietnam 46%. Why are these countries facing these higher tariffs, and what will the impact be on the region?
Absolutely. The highest tariff countries are basically very poor countries in Southeast Asia and South Asia and other developing Asian countries. And the benchmark in which to impose them are basically the U.S. trade balance with those countries. And there's a ratio they calculate divided by U.S. imports, and they divide it by 2. So essentially, it's very difficult for these countries to really try to lower it because it's not really about differentials in tariff rates or differential in trade practices, but really the outcome of that, right? So if your benchmark is a trade balance, then therefore, in order to rectify it, they have to import more U.S. goods, whether or not it's security goods like Lockheed Martin's procurement or Boeing's or agriculture goods. But a lot of these countries are not really at the position to do that. So it's very difficult for them. Meaning in the immediate, I think it's going to be very painful for a lot of the Asian countries. There are some exemptions that kind of alleviate the pain, such as semiconductor, commodities, and so on and so forth. But the big question is whether or not the semiconductor exemption is for more sectoral tariff to come, or they're actually easing costs for the U.S. But irrespective, this is a huge hit. It's very difficult for Asian exporters to find other markets in the short term. And very similarly, it's very difficult for U.S. importers to find alternatives because everyone's being hit within Asia. And so these are low-cost producers. The meaning in the short term is going to be painful. They do have some mitigating factors, but all of it point to a very sharp downturn of volume demand by the U.S. and thus very painful for the Asian countries.
Does this explain why we've not seen any countermeasures from most of these Southeast Asian economies, at least? They do not want to rile up the U.S. further?
Well, I think for a lot of the Asian countries that have a much different approach to the U.S. stated previously, with the exception of China, a lot of them are hoping that they could lower tariffs because fundamentally that would be the number one thing they would want to do, right? To continue to be able to export to the U.S. because the profit margins are so much better exporting to the U.S. relative to, say, competing within Asia, where there's already a flood of goods, particularly from China, competing with them, right? And there will be more, right, as a consequence. And there's only so much you can liberate to the EU and so on and so forth. So that would be the number one thing they would want to do. But like I mentioned, it's going to be very difficult to do because the benchmark is straight imbalance rather than the differentials in tariffs. But they're going to try anyway. The second part is that they can try to probably depreciate their currency versus the dollar, lower interest rates, have some fiscal support, targeted fiscal support, and the fiscal support would offset the deterioration of export demand elsewhere, right? But these are all temporary gaps. It highlights the bigger problem, which is that this is a path to wealth, and that path has been basically cut off for a lot of countries, particularly these poor countries. So they will need to find a growth model look in the future. And the big question mark is that is this the beginning of the end of globalization as we know it? And if so, what can these countries do to develop?
Is it the end of globalization as we know it?
Well, I think it's very much destroyed by the largest economy that is punctuating it, right? Because as you can already see, that tariffs are going up. The worries for the EU is that if the U.S. erects barriers with China having the heftiest, so there's a discussion, is it on top of already a lot of tariffs? So for China, it's not only 54 plus the 20-something, that's looking at 70-something. And China is not going to stop exporting. So if it's going to continue to export to the rest of the world, and if its domestic demand boosting package is not large enough, countries like the EU not only is retaliating, so erecting barrier to trades versus the U.S. is going to start to look at China as well. And the rest of the Asian countries also, they would want to export more to the U.S. But with tariff barriers, they're now not only having problems exporting, they also have faced a flood of Chinese goods. So what will they do about it? And I think that's going to be very problematic for globalization moving forward.
We'll leave it there for the moment. Trinh Nguyen, thanks so much for joining us.